Akin, thank you so much for joining the NABA Perspectives podcast. It's an absolute pleasure to have you with us.
Oh, thank you so much, Larry. Thanks to NABA executives, and I'm glad to be here.
It's our pleasure, no doubt. Now, we're going to be talking about climate change in Africa. More specifically, we're going to be talking about climate investing and climate finance on the continent. Huge topic, crucial topic, a lot happening in that respect. Before we get stuck in, for those who don't know about you, Akin, who don't know about Genesis Energy, just a couple of minutes. Could you give us a little bit of background? What's the story? Where are you coming from? Why are you interested in climate investing and climate change in Africa?
No, thanks, Larry. My name is Akin again, the chairman of Genesis Energy. We're clean energy infrastructure developers based out of London. We have investments in about 9 countries in Africa where we're developing renewable energy solutions, solar, small hydro, as well as decarbonizing dirty fuel generating assets with gas. My background is as an oil trader, oil and gas, and this was in the 90s, one of the structured oil trading companies that come out of Nigeria. Evolved around 2005, 2004, 2005 towards power projects, initially as a growth in terms of revenue growth. But with our first project in a West African country, we could see the impact that providing independent power solution could bring to communities, to countries, and to businesses. And so for me, I think it was that was around 2006. It was a turning point in my mindset. It was the convergence between business opportunity and growing revenues into actually doing good. And frankly, if you can find that convergence at some point within anyone's journey, I think it's where you actually find passion meeting common sense. So to that extent, we're very happy in Genesis about what we do. It's very tough. We enter the market at the time when there were no no outliers to learn from. The energy sector in Africa was completely barren. It was dominated by national utilities. There were no regulations, no investment protective policies in place to enable capital to flow. And so most of the capital that we had to deploy came from equity, came from our own equity, came from brothers and sisters and aunts and uncles and grandfathers. And of course, the commercial banks, who at the time, for most part of Africa, couldn't do more than 4 to 5 years. So it's very tough in starting up. But we learned something, invaluable lessons, acquired competencies, experiences, built systems and processes that today it's putting Genesis in the fore of being able to successfully and profitably develop, finance, execute, and manage clean energy projects in Africa.
All right, fantastic. I mean, fascinating background, and not least because you started in oil and gas, fossil fuels. You're now focused on renewables. So you've seen both sides of the equation here. You mentioned that you got started at a time when it was barren in terms of activity in the energy sector in Africa. Now, we know it's not nearly as barren as it used to be.
Yes.
A lot has changed in the last 20, 25, 30 plus years, both in terms of the interest that's coming into the energy sector in Africa, but of course also technological advances and sort of huge drops in the affordability of renewables, the viability of renewables. All of that is combined with the realities of climate change, which we know are hitting African economies very hard. So in many ways, it feels like the energy sector right now is at a bit of a nexus, a bit of an inflection point in terms of where it's going. Would you say that's a fair assessment of where we are? And could you give us a little bit of a sense of, now in 2024, how interesting, how exciting is investing in energy in Africa, especially renewables?
I think first and foremost, we have to look at the geography of Africa, the biodiversity, the enormity of the resources that we have. Yes, the challenges are there, and there's always challenge, right? There's always going to be challenges. Africa's challenged today because the rate of poverty on the continent is quite high compared to any other continent. So in terms of the negative impact of climate change, and Africa is feeling the most of the brunt of it. And again, largely because the economies are not robust enough to withstand the negative impacts. Zambia, for example, as most of Southern African countries, been hit with the aftermath of the El Nino climatic movement, and this has brought severe drought to Zambia. The government is about to declare a state of emergency in almost every sector: agriculture, electricity, etc. But this in itself, Larry, is an opportunity. The notion, of course, is that for us as economics, we say that never let a good crisis go to waste, because in a crisis situation, you can create new things, you can define new processes, systems. There's opportunity to start afresh. Africa is the least polluting in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. However, we also have perhaps the most opportunity to actually help the world. We have a huge forestry in terms of carbon sinks. I mean, look at the DRC, that's just endless. Whilst we have drought that is happening in Southern Africa as the aftermath of El Nino, you would actually find that in a report I recently read that we're having wetter East African. There used to be drier East African. That's why very recently in Kenya, we experienced very bad storm that unfortunately claimed a lot of lives. So in terms of now, that's just some of the aftermath of the negative side of what's happening in terms of the severe weather conditions and the impact in Africa. But if we leave that alone for 1 second and just focus around the energy bit of it, Africa's got two problems, as you all know. We have access problem for those who are not connected to any form of clean energy solution or clean energy infrastructure. Then we have availability problem, load shedding. You're connected in Nigeria, in Senegal, in South Africa, but then you got load shedding. So these two problems are there. But the fact is that the resources, the natural resources that we have, will and can and should enable us to leapfrog very quickly from a state of high hydrocarbon utilization and consumption to that of least hydrocarbon utilization and consumption. I mean, you've been to Norway all the time. I love the fact that I get to the airport and I see that sign, Norway powered by nature, and it's a dream. And I said to myself, good Lord, I'll love it one day to see Africa powered by nature. So what are the opportunities, Larry? I said to myself, the beauty of the solar solution is that it enables almost everyone with a sense of commerce in Africa to become an entrepreneur, a renewable energy developer, or a renewable energy product salesperson, or an infrastructure developer. Largely because solar, it's a very standardized product. You got solar PV, you have your inverter systems in order to transmit the electricity and then if you need to store it, you have your battery. It's not very complicated. It's not geothermal, it's not gas to power, and it's definitely not nuclear. And so to that extent, for the access problem, I do believe, and as most people agree, that deploying solar solutions and fast track to our villages, to our suburbias, to our communities, to both as an access solution to give people access to modern form of electricity, and at the same time as cost driver. In most countries today, in DRC, in South Africa, you would find that the cost of energy as a service from solar PV only is actually much lower than that of the national grid. So to that extent, it's good for business, it's good for commerce, it's good for the nature, and it's good for our communities. So I see solar as a fast track solution. I see, and anybody can do it. You don't need any specialized skills. We have so many enterprises, NGOs who are training, especially our women folk, who are the brunt of poverty in the rural communities. But then if you flip, but access is great, but then you have the metropolis that require availability because you have large industries that they're running 24 hours. You have hospitals that can't afford to blink. It's very difficult to solely rely on solar in these communities. And this is the place for gas. And this is why we say that as part of the just energy transition, you have to blend in gas because it creates that cleaner, but certainly a more reliable, more robust and at the same time competitive alternative to backup solutions of diesel, of coal, of heavy fuel. So it's not the destination, but it's a journey. And as part of that journey, it's important that we need to face the reality of things. What's the opportunity for financing? And I said to people that Africa doesn't really need help. There's a lot on offer. There's a lot. What we require are partnerships. And so you talk about financing. One of the things that I'm advocating for would be to have to democratize financing for infrastructure. It's too complicated. The processes and system by DFIs, and they mean very well to ensure that the monies that, and some of these monies from DFIs are from taxpayers' monies from different countries. So absolutely, there's got to be a responsible way of deploying that capital. But the whole essence of having DFI is to create impact. Now, if you need to go through rounds of project finance that continuously remind you of going to your local bank, they ask for your uncle, your aunts, your daddy, your grandfather, just to go and bring them, it takes them 5 years. I said to myself, where's the impact? So there's got to be a different way of financing, especially in this circumstance where we have one planet. It's great to visit Mars. It's great for everyone to travel to the moon, but we're still going to come back here. So to that extent, Africa pretend that the opportunity for real serious financiers for, to be able to, think outside of the box. Let's think through alternative way of structuring financing. And this is exactly what we're doing in Genesis with our partners.
Okay, there's a lot to unpack here. And I want to sort of pick up on two themes really that come out of this. One, you've already made the observation that in terms of potential, there's no shortage in Africa. We all know that, right? If you visit the IEA or any of these other agencies and organizations that provide data on renewable potential, it's off the scale when it comes to sub-Saharan Africa. Solar alone, if you were able to harness it, could basically power the whole world, right? So we know that. And when you look at geothermal, you look at wind, you look at hydro, you look at green hydrogen and green ammonia, all of this, no shortage of potential. At the same time, we all know that despite this, African economies attract the least, and by some way, the least in terms of financing and capital. And this seems to touch on two problems from my standpoint. One is the way Africa is perceived when it comes to climate change and climate action and climate investing, because we all know what the story is. The stereotypical story is Africa is poor. It has problems. The only way it's going to be able to deal with those problems, climate change or otherwise, is with aid. Yeah, and that, of course, invariably sort of bleeds into the perception from the investor and financing side that this is not a part of the world that is serious. This is not a place to deploy capital, and the numbers seem to back that up. What's your retort to this way of looking at the continent? First, the narrative around climate change, but two, this assumption by a lot of investors that Africa, that's not a place for us to go.
And I do agree with a lot of people that come down to Africa. They mean well to invest. They want to partner. They want to actually create a lot of impact. And then they get into Africa. They partner with locals, and sometimes things just don't work out, and they get discouraged and they move out. There's a lot of issues. And listen, one of the biggest elephants in the room is just cultural differences, the way we do things here. Right? You go to any part of Africa, there are over 54 countries in Africa. In some countries, there are tens and tens of tribes and in all sorts of cultural and religious undertone defining how people behave. And so sometimes I said to people that one of the biggest risks you're going to face investing in Africa is cultural nuances. And you need to pay attention to that. The numbers are very easy. Economics, data, all that is fantastic. I can sit in London and do all of that all day long, but you need to get your hands dirty. So I said to myself, what is driving this hesitation by most of potential investors to come into Africa? That's number one. Number two, what is limiting more Africans investing in the continent with all of the huge access to capital that we have in the diaspora? What is going on? I can only guess. So please don't take my word for it. My sense is that first we need to change our behavior in how we apply regulations. in how sometimes you have government agencies and how they either enable investment or discourage investment. And in many instances, unwittingly, a lot of agencies discourage investment because of red tapes, improper behaviors, all sort of things. Then you have there's a nuance today that energy is the next big thing. I'm going to make $1 billion out of it. And so there's also the get rich quick syndrome that whilst you can have off-grid solar solution, I can light up my roof, my shop, my hospital, I can put solar panels here, but to trade it as a business, you need a certain level of skills and you need discipline. And it's a business, and every business requires discipline, and you need to understand it fundamentally what it takes. And it's a service, a social service. So energy is not for the get rich quick. Now, my sense, therefore, is that beyond the rhetorics that we all hear in conferences, beyond the rhetorics that we all hear on the street and so on and so forth, the opportunities to remain for very serious investors to find serious local partners. And the various ways to do that. You have chambers of commerce, you have embassies of government of various countries and in different countries that can vet counterparts in local industry. You have so many avenues for you to be able to assess and access the sort of level of partners that you might be compatible with. So I think that should be the first step around how do you invest in Africa. I think partnership is critical. I think number two is on the government side, we want to attract money. And most heads of government I've seen and most leadership actually want to do that. They mean well. But unfortunately, they cannot be everywhere. They are not omnipresent. So at the end of the day, it's around how do you monitor? How do you supervise the enforcement of investment policies in creating that enabling environment in your country? It starts from the airport. You get into some airport in Africa, and it's almost like they're asking you, "What the hell are you doing here?" And so, are they more welcoming, or is it more of a handshake or a shakedown? So all these things matter. Before, so if I was the head of government or part of government, the first thing I would do is the entry point. The first ambassador to my country are the customs and immigration that visitors will see. The second layer with the police on the streets. This is very important. So wishful thinking around just showing how great opportunity is, is like the poison chalice. It's so beautiful, but you can't touch it because as soon as you put your hand in it, bam, you get smacked in the back. So anyway, I'll pause there for a while.
Like what you're saying, it makes me think of a phrase that I sometimes use. When you work with Africa, you hear the phrase "open for business" a lot.
Yes.
And I always say it's good to be open for business. The question is, are you ready for business?
Yes.
and that's a different matter, right? Like being open and being ready. Look, I hear what you're saying, and I can't argue with that. Like zooming out a little bit, back to this question of Africa the victim. I feel like this is part of the problem, that Africa is seen purely as a victim. We all know the impact of climate change is very real. We all know the energy needs are very real. Like, no honest person is going to deny that. That said, the conclusion seems to be that therefore this place needs aid. Now, last September, you'll recall we had the first ever Africa Climate Summit in Nairobi.
Yes.
William Ruto, he very prominently put himself out there saying that, look, enough of this. Look, yes, we have problems, but Africa is also a place that offers solutions. We saw in COP27 in Egypt, Africa's COP movement towards more of a voice for emerging markets, including Africa. At COP28, we saw the milestone loss and damage fund being agreed. It's not up and running yet. However, there's this growing sense that the voice of Africa is sort of creeping into the discourse a little bit more. Are you seeing this happening? And how much should we put into occasions like the Africa Climate Summit in Nairobi? Is it just another conference, or are we seeing something a little bit more happening?
I think we're seeing a lot more happening, Larry. I mean, when I look at my visit to various governments, heads of government over the past 6 months, I've seen government set up specific units that are focused around enabling and catalyzing more investment within the renewable energy space, around educating their people around behavioral patterns that are destructive to our planet. So I see that, and you know what? It's always a long game, right? So it's not going to be magical. It took a long time for this carbon greenhouse to build up there. It's going to take much longer time to actually clean it up. I do not believe that Africa is a victim, because you're a victim only to the extent that there was a deliberate course of action taken to undermine you. The world developed, and it developed from the West technologically, and industrialization happened. Resources of the earth were used, and at that time, with the knowledge that was available, resources were used to advance mankind and standard of living. Is the reason why you and I we can talk today from distances. And over 100 years ago in Africa, that would be witchcraft, right? So development did happen, but unfortunately, the downside from the development is that Africa, which is the least polluting, actually has perhaps the worst end of the stick, because the continent is mostly not that developed, and therefore is not able to be climatic resilient because of its weak economies. So to that extent, we're not victims, and therefore we do not need, I don't think the approach should be that we need help. No, we do need partners. Africa wants to advance. Africa is committed to advance. Governments have spoken to, they're very serious about advancing. But it's a long journey, Larry, so it's not magical. Infrastructure, by just the nature of breadth of infrastructure, takes time to structure, takes time to finance, takes time to build. And so we must never take that away from the equation. And so as some of these governments they're struggling with so many issues, there's the aftermath of COVID that left most of African economy in crisis. Let's just start there. And we're still struggling away from the smarting away, and I'm sorry to say, and then the Russo-Ukraine war jumps up. And frankly, it was just after this war I realized how much food basket Ukraine is, and how much Africa has been linked to supplies from Ukraine. It's amazing.
It was a bit of a wake-up call, wasn't it?
Because
I didn't appreciate just how dependent the continent was on those two countries in Europe. You know, who'd have thought?
Absolutely. So those two things happened, and the government, they're dealing with so much. I mean, in the UK, you and I were here, right? We're both residents here, and if someone said to me that the inflation in UK will ever rise up to 3%, I would say they're mad. It went to 13%, Larry. So it wasn't just Africa. So globally, there's been global economic downturn, but Africa is also the most hit. So my sense, therefore, is that as these governments are grappling with all of these dangerously moving parts, they also still need to transition away from hydrocarbons. Now, they need hydrocarbons for working capital. Africa needs hydrocarbons for working capital. It's a source of working capital. Because for most countries, their economies depend on hydrocarbons by way of export for foreign exchange earnings. My country, Nigeria, is one, right? And so you can't say to Nigeria, stop selling oil. I mean, there's going to be something wrong about that. It's not going to happen. But I do believe,
or don't develop your gas reserves, right?
No, I don't think. But I think that also, and I said to people, I don't believe somebody is telling you not to develop your gas reserve. I think what they're saying is that, well, I don't have the money to give you. If you have the money to, you go and do it. And so this is where you have countries like Morocco and so on. I'm excited when I was a guest of the Moroccan ambassador as part of the Invest Africa initiative very recently, and they were talking about the export of a gigawatt of electricity from solar from Morocco to Europe, all the way down to the UK. Yeah. So can we see more of that happening? I think so.
I think the project is, I think it's X-Links, it's called, which is basically a solar cable between Morocco and the UK. Yeah, the first time I heard that, I thought that sounds made up, but it's very real. And it is happening, which is, I think it's a fantastic illustration, right, of the potential in the energy space on the continent, right? Who would have thought a cable running from Morocco supplying the United Kingdom with solar power. It just gives you a glimpse into the potential. Now,
Correct.
you have to some extent preempted a question I was going to ask, which was this issue of just transition. Because while very few people, at least I come across very few people who are principally opposed to the idea of transitioning away from fossil fuels, while there are very few people out there like that, there are a lot of people who obviously make the point that, well, as Nigeria, we can't realistically just stop selling oil or gas and developing solar. It's just not going to work, right? And I don't think we have to spend a lot of time on that because I think I think I'm reading between the lines, but it seems to me that you're very much on board with the pragmatic approach to this, which is, look, if you've got gas, develop it as long as you have a plan, right, to transition away.
Absolutely.
Okay. All right. So we're on the same page there, and I think that the reasonable pragmatic perspective when it comes to Africa will sort of understand that. But there's another element here, and I'm not sure how to feel about this one. It's difficult to talk about energy security or transition without some element of geopolitics in that.
Sure.
And we all know what's happening globally, and we all know that Africa is, at the very least, geographically, once again, between the two emerging blocks here, which I think can broadly be split in between East and West. You know, we don't need to go into the details of that, but we all see the news, we all watch the news, we all know what's happening. And that, to me, leads to a very important question from an African standpoint when it comes to the key issue of partners. And you made that point. We need partners and we need partnership. One of the great things that's happened over the last 20 plus years or so, of course, is the emergence of new potential partners globally for African economies. Now, be that Asia, be that the Middle East, be that South America, Europe, etc. However, now we find ourselves in a situation where it's like, well, one side may be saying this, the other side may be saying that. You throw in geopolitics. Are we in danger of getting to a place where Africa is going to be forced to choose partners, or told it can't work with certain economies, for example? Like, let's say you want to do renewable energy with China. That's going to raise some eyebrows in other parts of the world. How much of an issue do you think this is? I mean, it's obviously important, but to what extent does this really impact the energy space?
Yeah, I don't want to simplify it or sound like a simpleton, but the truth is that African countries and African leaders and governments and their people need to decide for themselves what's in their best interest, right? It's about negotiation. And I don't think there's any powers in the East and the West that is saying that Africa shouldn't deal with this or that. But I think that in terms of how business grows and how economies prosper, Larry, the core of every economy is the SME. It provides the greatest amount of employment. It turns up the highest amount of return to GDPs in most African countries. And so therefore that core of the society is critical to your progress. My sense is this, it is difficult to have growth or partnership with countries where there are no strong diversified interaction between the SMEs of one country and SMEs of another foreign country. If we go to UK today, you likely walk down the supermarket and you can find a British guy who's in partnership with a Nigerian on the street. If you go down to South Africa, you'll find a guy from Germany who's got a partnership with a shoemaking factory with a South African. So that's SME business, that interaction. Now, that interaction itself defines where countries will place their priority. And so in terms of how the East interacts with Africa, my assessment, and I'm totally wrong, is that it's always been that of trade, supply goods, supply services. The deep interaction that most of Africa has with, for example, United Kingdom, United States, France, Europe, etc., doesn't really exist with a lot of countries in the East. When I say East, I'm talking Far East. So if you look at Southeast Asia or India, Pakistan, you see a whole lot of very active interaction among the SMEs. Same thing in Europe. But when I go to China, you go to China, what I see is supply of goods and services. I don't see that strong interaction. Same thing when you go to Russia. I don't see Russians running around Africa partnering with everybody, every supermarket. So I think I would worry less about all of these geopolitical conversations, because frankly, it's none of our business. Our business should be to put your country and your people where it's most advantageous for your citizens at any point in time. And buying goods from China is important. We continue to buy our solar panel, solar system from China because we get it in good quality at least cost price. If I buy that same thing from Germany, for example, I'm going to pay 10 times the price, and therefore I'm unable to serve my customers in Africa who are unable to pay that price. So it's just really, I would say that let's just apply common sense to all that we do.
Yeah, I like that. A bit of common sense, a bit of pragmatism, and a healthy sense of self-interest and national interest, which I would say in many ways is maybe the most important part, because, you know, we spend a lot of time talking about, oh, what does the world want from Africa? We don't have much of the reverse conversations. Well, what do we need from them? You know, like,
absolutely. I'm not concerned about what you want from me. I also need to know what I want from you.
Exactly, right? I mean, and if it makes sense, there's a trade, right? It's not inherently nefarious or bad or good. Okay, look, we're coming up to our limit, and I'm conscious of your schedule, but you know, we could go on like this for quite a while. But I want to get back to the financing for one last point here, and that is, of course, the eternal question of where is it going to come from, and a lot of emphasis, a lot of the discourse seems to be focused on international capital, international investment. Easy to see why. You know, domestically, the resources arguably in many cases just aren't there. And it is not realistic that you will be able to transform the energy sector across Africa without partnership internationally.
Yes.
Now, at the same time, are we maybe underestimating the resources that are available domestically? I guess the question here is, how do you see this coming together in the coming years? Like, should we be looking primarily outside of Africa for the financing? Should we be focusing more on internal resources? How does this, like, what from your perspective is a good mix here of how it's going to come together, and is it going to come together?
Indeed. So first and foremost, I believe eternally in partnerships. I do believe that Africa needs to continue to partner with countries, international countries and communities that are taking it seriously. That's important. There's no point wasting your energies on those that don't take it seriously. Ignore them and focus on those that take it very seriously. And so to that extent, we should always seek capital wherever you can get it. But the biggest success factor for me is localizing your own financing capacity. Charity begins at home. So one of the few things that I would like to encourage is just localized funding, right? Some time ago in 2019, we localized funding of about 50 billion program Nigerian naira, issued at the time the largest energy bond of 13 billion. That bond was co-guaranteed by US government through USAID. Now, and as well as InfoCredit. Now that is a good blend. So it's blended finance. I'm taking guarantee out of the USG. It increased the credit rating of our local subsidiary from BBB plus to AAA capital, just by virtue of bringing in that co-guarantee from the US government and InfoCredit. Now, the money sits in the US, is not moving to Nigeria. We ensure a responsible company that will structure the securities around that, around the US government being able to issue this guarantee in a way that, frankly, they will never be called upon to ever pay a dime. But the guarantee is important because it gives the pension funds the confidence that hard-earned savings of pensioners would never go to waste. In the likely event that anything terrible happens, you've got the co-guarantee of InfoCredit and US government to stand behind it. Now that's blended finance. Now you say to yourself, how much of that can you do? So that is one. You can do so many of it. You know, you can do with so many countries in the world that can do the same. They can follow the same suit to partner with African enterprises, particularly the SMEs. I'm going to focus on the SMEs. The biggest consumer of energy could be the big industries and so on in terms of quantum per location, but in terms of scale, it remains the SMEs and the larger private residential quarters. Now, by finding financing solution that would solve the biggest cost driver problem for the SMEs, which is energy in most countries. If you can find these solutions locally, and the government can put their ministers of finance, can put their the central bank governors, can put the heads of banking institutions to test, to say, listen, I don't want you messing around with treasury bills and just commercial banking for the sake of money. But I need you now to be supportive of the real sector. What guarantees do you need to make that happen? So I think localizing capital. Number three is this: we have so much expansive land in Africa. This very rare resource, is it being actually monetized in a way that can stand behind so many financial institutions to be able to leverage all of these physical assets to do a lot more? So I just think that we need to learn to think outside of the box. Nothing is done until it is done. So the fact is that we need to always try and be more innovative, create new financing structure. We should never stick to the old ways. If we stuck to the old ways, we're still going to be in buggies.
Yeah. Well, we wouldn't be where we are today, right? If at some point in history someone didn't decide, you know what, it's time to do it differently, right?
Exactly.
Okay, look, there's so much more that we could get into here, like no joke. But you know, we don't have 3 hours, unfortunately, for this. One final quick one I want to throw at you, if you don't mind. If you're looking ahead over the next 5-10 years or so, energy in Africa, particularly renewables, what excites you about the future of renewables in Africa, and what worries you about the future of renewables in Africa?
The future of renewable in Africa is exciting for us in Genesis because we're looking at a convergence between energy security and food security. So we've come up with concept, with initiative and solution that will address a resilient agricultural sector, where, for example, we can put in cold room storages. You may not be aware, for example, Larry, that one of the biggest challenges you have in Africa is that perishable foods and goods and staple food goes to waste because they just don't have cold room storages for them. And where storages exist, they cannot afford to power those storages. So this is where solar power solution comes in. The solar power solution can power the storages with your battery as backup. They can also light up the communities around the storages. Farmers and agro-allied industries in those areas can now store at a very small fee their produce and sell at a premium. Most farmers rush to sell because they know that if they don't sell within a short space of time, it's gone. So they're forced, they do not have the seller's bargain. It becomes a buyer's bargain because they're forced to sell. So they're constantly being pressured just by the dysfunctionalities in the system. So what excites us is the convergence between energy security driven by renewable energy, as well as food security driven by a resilient agricultural sector.
Look, I'm fascinated by that, and that in itself is a huge topic for discussion. Maybe when we can have you back on to delve deeper into, because it's the first time I've come across anyone connecting those two.
Yes.
And you know, like, you don't need to understand much about economic development to see why those two are kind of fundamental, right, to getting anywhere as a nation. You didn't answer what worries you. That's what excites you, and it's absolutely amazing. But what worries you?
I think nothing about renewable energy actually worries me. But I think that because it's all very, the opportunity is real. Earth, for so long as the sun rises and sets, you're going to have solar. So long as you got rivers, you're going to have hydro. So long as you have wind, you're going to have wind power. The ocean is never going to get dry, so you're going to have waves. So my sense is that nothing about renewable energy worries me. But of course, you have to apply discipline, regulation. It's going to be better regulated. But in terms of what concerns me would be the approach that DFIs, financial institutions, are taking towards funding renewable energy. You cannot use the same traditional approach that you used for all these years and apply that same brush to, you're focused on too much. They need to have a greater threshold of risk, measured risk. And there's so many tools out there to protect against risk, but they've got to be more pragmatic, and they have to be a lot more collaborative. Right now is go and de-risk all the projects and then bring it, then I can finance it. It becomes a no-brainer. There's no impact. That bothers me, Larry. So I'd like to talk more about that as we go on.
Yeah, and I mean that's an important, a crucial topic as well, right? A discussion in its own right, and I
Yes.
hear where you're coming from. Anyway, we have to wrap up on what I would say is a bullish note with a slight sort of hint of just caution, of just eyes wide open going into Africa. But look, all I can say is thank you so much. We will definitely have to have you come back on because there's a lot more in the tank, so to speak, that we'd love to get into. But thank you so much for your time, fantastic insight, and for doing the work that you do. It's important, and keep at it.
No, thank you, Larry, and thanks to NABA. Listen, it's platform like this will enable people like ourselves who are not movie stars to be able to add our 2 cents to these conversations. Thank you.
Well, that's more than 2 cents. Thank you so much.